Hello and welcome to Pit Talk, a Fox Sports and Speed Cafe Formula One podcast. On today's episode, we take a look at the state of the 2024 driver market with one world champion still out of contract and Daniel Ricciardo's long-term future still to be decided. My name is Michael Laminato, motorsport writer for Fox Sports Australia, and it's great to have your company and the company of my co-host from Speed Cafe. It is the mid-season break, but there's no mandatory shutdown at his house. It's Matt
I wish
Koch.
there was at points because it's just absolute chaos. I've still got suitcases and stuff that haven't been unpacked sitting just strategically out of camera shots. So, yeah, we haven't botched this one together at all.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of mandatory. Anyone who's involved or even watches Formula One should be allowed to take the mid-season break. Mandatory 10 days of Formula
Well, Ian has, hasn't he?
Just to...
Ian's
exactly
sunning
right.
himself on a beach somewhere, and yeah, jeez.
Yeah, maximising. He kept waving the sporting regulations at us before he left. Like, it doesn't apply to you. It's a podcast. You're not a Formula One team. So good luck to him. I hope he's having a great time. One day we will also take time off, you and me, Matt. But let's talk in this mid-season break. Over the course of the next couple of weeks, we will be kind of unpacking the first half of the season, debriefing what we've learned, what we can expect in the second half of the year, who we think will win the World Championship. You got any guesses? You want to get this episode out of the way in the next 5 seconds? Oh.
Yuki's got it sealed up.
This week we're going to focus... Yeah, well, I mean, he will feature heavily, at least in this week's episode, Yuki, because he needs to seal his contract, first of all. That is one of the big questions of the second half of the year. In this episode, we'll be chatting about the driver contract situation, the driver market for 2024. We are in a bit of a half cycle, I suppose. Most of the big names and most of the seats at the top teams are already accounted for. But really, as we learned last year, Matt, and we are pretty much on the anniversary of the mid-season break disrupting news that came out of Alpine and Aston Martin, it actually doesn't take that much, a relatively small piece of ignition for everything to go
I
on.
understand a tweet has been published without my knowledge or permission. This time 12 months ago was obviously the Oscar Piastri stuff that shook out and saw him at McLaren. So you're right, it doesn't take a whole lot for the whole market to change. And we saw that with Sebastian Vettel last year deciding to retire, and then Fernando Alonso surprisingly jumping ship, which is actually a funny turn of phrase, given that that's apparently where he was when that all happened. It doesn't take much, but I'm a bit like you in that it's a half term in contract speak. It's sort of half term. There's a lot of drivers out there that signed on multi-year deals when the new set of regulations came in at the start of last year, so they're sort of in year 2 of 3, for the most part. The big one that's out of contract, and you mentioned it up the top, is just a namey little 7-time world champion in Lewis Hamilton. So he's the big one, but there's not really much of a question mark there, is there, Michael?
Well, there shouldn't be, right? And I remember you and I were in Spain, and this was the weekend. Obviously, Lewis had a reasonable weekend overall for Mercedes. Lewis was on the podium, and Toto Wolff said afterwards, we're talking about days, not weeks, or a matter of days, words to that effect. And I mean, I think as Ian said a couple of weeks ago, technically that's still true. Everything is a day. But even Lewis in the post-race press conference suggested that they'd be talking that week. And while he didn't say anything definitive, because he's pretty good at never saying anything too definitive about contracts, he did sort of, the vibe of it was it's coming sooner rather than later. That was now a couple of months ago. That was back in May. We're into the mid-season break. It's probably unlikely we'll hear anything before, let's say, the week before the next race in the Netherlands, just because of the way the break tends to work. But every week that goes on, I don't want to sound like I'm Christian Horner just stirring the pot, but every week that goes on it just adds that tiny bit of doubt. In a similar way, Matt, I guess if we cast our minds back, when was it? A couple of years ago, 21, I want to say. All those pandemic years do blur into one. When we had a similar situation where he actually overran his contract, signed kind of temporary deal a month into the year that got him into his next deal, and he eventually signed it. I guess technically that can't be off the cards considering we've got here. But what do we know about the hold-up, I suppose? If we keep talking about this, as Toto Wolff said last week, I think his words were emotionally a done deal. Well, what's the gap between emotionally and legally?
Well, yeah, it can be significant if your name's Alpine.
Yeah.
Too soon?
Yeah.
So, interestingly, this is a contract that Lewis is usually involved or has been involved in negotiating his contracts, either be that directly or in partnership with his father in the past. This time it's almost hands off. He said that he's not involved in it at this point. It's in the hands of his lawyers, which is something new as well. It is the nitty-gritty. He's gone into that sort of specifics, and it's nothing big. It sounds like a number and a duration and all those sorts of things. The bulk of the contract have been agreed upon. But if you remember the contract that he's on now, one of the big inclusions in that was some programs within Mercedes as an organization in terms of diversity and helping the underprivileged and underrepresented and those sorts of things within the broader operation, not just Formula One, but Mercedes as a car company as well. So I imagine there's things like that they're bashing out now, getting the legalese, dotting the I's and crossing the T's. That stuff takes time. If they're both saying that the bulk of it's done, there's no panic. I mean, they don't need to panic. They're still 6 months away from the end of the year, realistically, because that's when pre-season will start. That's sort of the start of the next year, so to speak. They don't have to panic. So this being drawn out, it's still not as drawn out as it was in 21. I think you're right there, Michael. I think it was 21. At the start of that year, he didn't have a contract. So it's still not that drawn out. And that was a negotiation process that was exactly the same. Oh, yeah, we'll get it done all year. And then, it's not done. But it'll be fine, we'll get it done. And then eventually it got across the line, and I think he signed a 1 year deal, and then very soon after that, he extended that to 2 or 3, which is the current deal. And at that point, pretty much all of us called it the final Formula One contract of his career. He's going to prove us all wrong. I think he's 36, so he'll be one of the older statesmen. I mean, he made his debut back in 2007. But yeah, he's still hungry for that 8th World Championship. That's what's keeping him going. I don't think he's going to give up on that anytime soon. And you'd have to think that a new contract would take him through to the next generation of rules coming in, which is 2026. So you'd think that there's probably 2 or 3 more years on top of what he's already got left in him. And yeah, it's just a matter of time. I think it's got to be done.
Yeah, I mean, to begin with, there are no alternatives for him, short of deciding to retire, which does not. He's at no point suggested that is on his mind for next year. No. Has emphasised many, many times he intends to continue, and with Mercedes, it would be the about face of all Formula One about face if he said, actually, that I'm retiring, or he found some other team that was having space for him. So I think that's exactly right. It's really, it seems like it's surely a matter of time. Really interesting you bring up, though, to cast our minds back to 2021 when that deal was done, the so-called presumed last contract of Lewis Hamilton, which we know now is
the second last contract of Lewis Hamilton.
The second last contract. And look, you can adjust that language as we go. No one will listen to this episode in 3 years when he signs another one. It's really interesting because at the time it seemed so logical, because it seemed he was destined to win that 8th title. Like, that was going to be it. He was going to check it off. 2021, that was the year he came so close to sealing the 8th. And it's proved obviously quite elusive since then. There's an unclear next best date at which he might get that 8th contract. That's his driver. He's kind of come close and occasionally pretty much said as much. But how does that set up this last chapter, do you think? Because it almost does feel like we've entered a bit of a parallel universe. There's another universe where he's won the 8th title and he's retired, which, I mean, incredible to think almost now of a Formula One without Lewis Hamilton. Not only because he's been around so long, but such an enormous figure in the paddock. But there is a universe where he's retired, as opposed to this one where he's still very obviously searching for a title that feels even further away from certain than it does last year, to be honest. I mean, you mentioned the next regulations, but we now know that Mercedes can be tripped up by regulation changes.
Yeah, they can both step ahead and fall on their face, can't they? It's interesting. That's the beauty of Formula One. And that's also half the reason why we've got more prescriptive regulations these days, to try and bunch the field up and create these opportunities that we saw Aston Martin take massive steps at the start of the year. McLaren's done the same. Alpine at points has made steps this year. So this jumbling up of that order is very, very deliberate. And the teams have bought into that. It must, it's not been forced upon them. They've bought into it through the Formula One Commission and everything else. So what's interesting for me is that, and what I think is enticing Lewis, is that Mercedes is one of those teams that's made progress. they've made changes to their car and it's stepped them forward, but then they take half a step back. So there's still a lot of learning to be done at Mercedes, and I think that's what entices him to carry on. It's that journey he keeps talking about. It's a little bit like Michael Schumacher at Ferrari. When Michael joined Ferrari in 1996, it was a team in, I won't say disarray, but it was certainly at a low ebb. It hadn't won a championship since 1979 in terms of the drivers and 82 in terms of the constructors. They had the building blocks there to be successful. Now, Mercedes had the building blocks there when Lewis joined, and he was sort of right place, right time a couple of years later. Those building blocks are still there. They've lost a few staff, but they've juggled others around, and everything that fundamentally underpinned the success from 2014 is still in place. They've still got Toto Wolff. They've still got James Allison. They've still got all the rest of them. They might be in slightly different responsibility roles now, but they're all still there helping guide the team, set the culture. And that's a big part of what drives the team forward is culture, because you build confidence from that. So if they can keep that stability there, and that's crucial as well, there's a good chance they'll take further steps forward. Now, will they catch Red Bull? Absolutely not this year. Not a chance. Next year, maybe, but realistically, you're probably already looking at 2025 before Lewis has got a genuine championship chance again. But then the flip side, and you mentioned this, who do you replace him with? I've just got a matrix up that I put together a little while ago. Their reserve driver, Mick Schumacher, would have to be one of the better bets outside of him. But this is the point, though, isn't it? If he's sort of next best. Otherwise, outside of him, you go and poach a Felipe Drugovich or a Stoffel Van Dorn from Aston Martin. They're in this sort of Mercedes family as well. Outside of them, you have to go and steal someone from another team. And the guys at the front end of the field are already sort of where they want to be, if that makes sense. And I'm looking off camera because I've got the list next to me. For those of you watching on YouTube, if you're not, just imagine me looking to the left.
You yourself could look to the left to experience what Matt is experiencing.
Let's live this together.
Yeah.
I mean, Alpine, Gasly and Ocon, they're not going anywhere. They're locked in. McLaren, Lando Norris, maybe. Is he for sale? Who would they replace him with at McLaren? You'd have to have someone ready to drop in there if you're going to auction your driver off. Ferrari, Leclerc, maybe. Sainz, maybe. But they're not Lewis Hamilton. It's kind of as simple as that, isn't it?
Mm. Yeah, and look, that's true. No one can literally replace Lewis Hamilton, short of, I guess, a Fernando Alonso or a Max Verstappen. Max is not going to join Mercedes. Fernando is an interesting hypothetical, though, depending on how the Aston Martin project continues. If we're talking about, in this hypothetical, let's say end of next year, if Aston Martin doesn't feel like it's making progress, I'm sure he would absolutely jump at a Mercedes opportunity. Acknowledging, though, that Mercedes is not the dominant team it was only a couple of years ago, when obviously anybody would go for Mercedes if they were offered. But, poaching does seem like what they would do, right? That's, if we think about the example of George Russell joining the team, he was never going to be thrown into that team. He had to spend 3 years at Williams, and I think in retrospect they all acknowledge that was probably a year too much. But 3 years was what they deemed, for the Mercedes culture, the most appropriate balance of risk versus reward for this great young driver they've brought through. So that's why I can't really imagine a Mick Schumacher or a Drugovich or anyone like that being given the call-up, because it just doesn't seem like the way Mercedes does it. And like you say, it's same management there that ultimately led George Russell into the team. So I could definitely see, if in this wacky hypothetical Lewis Hamilton does decide he's done, that's going to be enormous, because it's going to be an established driver they're going to be poaching. It is going to be, I think the names you mentioned were pretty spot on. Lando Norris is connected to virtually every team, despite him saying he likes being at McLaren. I think he actually does like being at McLaren, but people will still call him. Yeah. You've got to think that on a low ebb, you could probably convince one of the Ferrari drivers life will be better at Mercedes, which it probably would be. I think I can only see that being a poaching situation. Ocon could be an interesting one too, given his historical connections to Toto Wolff. Not connected to Mercedes anymore, and you could argue maybe his star is faded a little bit.
The other one's Alex Albon.
I would imagine. That is a great suggestion, considering how well he's been doing this year. I would be surprised if a higher up team weren't already knocking on his door, but by that same token, would expect Williams to play much harder ball than they have with, for example, Valtteri Bottas those years ago, because you get the sense that, I mean, particularly under James Vowles, he is, and he talked about this when he's been hiring in the technical department, wants his signature assignment, signature acquisitions, if you like, make statement acquisitions. And he wants leadership people. He doesn't want a kind of rotating situation that Williams has been through so many years. And Alex Albon seems like he fits that mold. Like, he does feel like, I mean, I'm sure he'd love to be in a more competitive car. And we'd all like Williams to be more competitive. But he does kind of feel like the guy for the moment there. I'd really love to see him achieve success at Williams, but he'd have to be in a conversation at any of the teams we're going to talk about today.
Look, these guys have limited shelf lives. If an opportunity comes to progress your career, you have to take it, regardless of how loyal you are to a team or an organisation or whatever. I mean, go back to Oscar Piastri. He absolutely did the right thing for himself, for his career. There is no loyalty so much in Formula One. You've got to look after number one because you've got that finite period to make your name, to make your career, to win a world championship. So Alex Albon, he's very comfortable. He's very happy, very relaxed at Williams. Just the team, the ethos, the project there, he's bought into it wholesale. There's no doubt about that. Given that, he'd probably never leave unless something genuinely interesting came knocking. And I think Mercedes potentially offers that because it's going to win races before Williams does, you would think.
Yeah, that's also, and we will move on because Williams does have a driver up for contract, but I do want to get, of course, to Daniel Ricciardo first. But Williams doesn't feel, I mean, it's no longer anchored to the bottom anymore. You can't say that any team will come knocking and immediately the driver will be interested. If it were Haas or Sauber or Alpha Tauri. I mean, Alpha Tauri is his own reason he may not go back there, but they're not automatics. And even potentially Alpine, depending on what he thinks Williams is doing, not necessarily an automatic. And that's kind of interesting in the broader context. But let's talk about Daniel Ricciardo now and Yuki Tsunoda, both out of contract at Alpha Tauri. And this has taken on a real new dimension of interest for obvious reasons. We've talked about Daniel Ricciardo many times over the last couple of podcasts since he's come back into Formula One at the Hungarian Grand Prix. He's there specifically on a 6-month loan. And in the last week, Christian Horner's been saying, well, if he does well, he will not be at Red Bull Racing next year. He said this many times, but he emphasised it again. If he does well, he will get, potentially, a 12-month extension at AlphaTauri to prove whether or not he can get into Red Bull Racing at 2025. Yuki Tsunoda's also out of contract. He also wants that seat. He said that explicitly in Hungary when, naturally enough, he was asked about it. We'll also be aiming for 2025. I mean, this is all hypothetical now because we don't know how Daniel's going to go because we don't have a big enough sample size so far, other than he's done pretty well in his first 2 races, I think it's fair to say. But do you see any changes at AlphaTauri? Is there too much going on there now to risk throwing one of those drivers out when it feels like this is the pressure moment Red Bull loves building their drivers around?
So I'm going to answer that in a little bit of a Max Verstappen way. It's story time with Matt. Usually if you watch Max Verstappen's live streams, he goes into story time with Max. And he tells some brilliant... Go and check him out after this podcast. Go and check him out because some of them are really quite interesting. The reason I preface it like that is that I sat down with Liam Lawson over the Belgian Grand Prix weekend. I had a list of questions for him, and there were some topics that I was not allowed to go into. Specifically, one of the questions I had is it Formula One for you or bust? He's currently racing in Super Formula with a view to get to Formula One, but he's obviously, again, got a finite shelf life. He's got an expiration date on his opportunity to get to Formula One. And it is, let's be honest, it's closing. He's maybe got this year to get into Formula One next year, or potentially for 25. After that, he's probably old news. And that's not to say that he's not good enough. It's just that's the way Formula One works. It moves on. Now, I found it interesting that I wasn't allowed to explore that line of questioning. I don't know what to make of that, but it's unusual for a team to shut down a line of questioning like that, unless it's something particularly controversial. You know, McLaren sort of did it with Oscar when he joined there, and you know, a few sort of things with that, and Daniel on that side as well. So I don't know whether to read into that Liam is in the frame. Maybe if Liam wins the Super Formula Championship, he replaces Yuki. I don't know. But it's interesting that the pressure at AlphaTauri seems to be on Yuki's side of the garage more than Daniel's, which is a fascinating thing after 2 race weekends into his return. And okay, in Hungary, he over-delivered, in my opinion. He beat Yuki in pretty much every meaningful session, or in every meaningful session, qualifying and the race. In Belgium, it was more balanced, and particularly on Sunday, Tsunoda performed better. Obviously, Daniel's Sunday was compromised by his qualifying on Friday, but Tsunoda still beat him on the racetrack, and that's where it matters. You look at the results, and that's what matters. The story of how you get there is irrelevant in the wash-up. So it's 1-1 at this point, but that it's 1-0 and not 2-0 in favour of Tsunoda is interesting. After 3 years at the end of this season in Formula One, the question also is, has Tsunoda peaked? Is this as good as he's going to get? That's another question that we probably can't answer. We know how good Daniel can be, so it'll be the comparison between Yuki and Daniel inside AlphaTauri, and probably more the point inside Red Bull, because neither of them are going to Red Bull next year. Sergio Perez is in that drive. No matter how much we want Daniel to be there, it's Sergio Perez will be in that seat next year alongside Max Verstappen, unless he has some almighty fall off in the second half of the year. I can't see that happening. In which case, how does Liam fit in? Why were Red Bull so protective of him? That's what's now got me thinking. There's a story there. I just don't know what the story is just yet.
Reminds me of when I think it was with Pierre Gasly before he was promoted, and also Antonio Felix da Costa, both of whom, speaking to the media, suggested they were bound for Formula One before they should have said anything. And resultantly, Felix da Costa never made it. Partly because it seemed like, this was a while ago, his memory's a little bit hazy, but partly because there was a falling out essentially with the Red Bull program for the way he was talking about being lined up to drive for Toro Rosso as it was at the time. Pierre Gasly eventually took a longer route via Super Formula and made it into Formula One. I can't help but I think that's part of it, this management of making sure that there's already so much speculation around these seats, not having the drivers play into it. Even I think the way that Daniel and Yuki have addressed it has been it's always been straight bat. Daniel hasn't been afraid to say he wants Red Bull, but has also been very focused on saying, I'm at AlphaTauri now, we've got to sort out the problems with this car. Yuki's been allowed to say, obviously I want to race for Red Bull, that's the whole reason this program exists, but has also said, I'm here to learn a lot from Daniel. They've been really straight bat about it, and I can't help wonder whether that's playing into it. Interesting read as well, though, and I think you're right, it does still feel like there's a little bit more pressure on Yuki's side. From my read of it, it's a little bit because Christian Horner seems to have a lot of faith in Daniel, at least at this stage. Clearly what he saw in the simulator the first half of the year and that legendary mythological tyre test at Silverstone that was 7 laps, I think Christian Horner said before he was on the phone getting him to AlphaTauri. Clearly he's seen enough that he's convinced that Daniel can be that driver because he's already talking about that extra 12 months. That can still change, obviously, in the second half of the year. And the same way, theoretically, Sergio Perez could absolutely fall off the wagon. So could Daniel or Yuki, alternatively. But it does still feel like if they're going to get rid of anyone, it is potentially Yuki. Because it also, in a weird way, still kind of makes sense. He's in his 3rd year. He's had his shot. I know you can argue that about Daniel as well, but this is kind of the rebirth, if you like. It's not so much just him being at the end of his career. There is still something to play out with Daniel's story. As far as Yuki's going to go with this team, it does feel like it's this year and next year. And then, Liam Lawson, if he wins Super Formula, like you say, what more can he do? And Red Bull have invested in him. He's also not just on the phone constantly to Helmut Marko. If Red Bull can't promote him after winning Super Formula and having invested in him for years, then you've got to kind of wonder what the point of it would be.
It is the problem that they now have. There's a little bit of a logjam because Max is so successful. It's almost like the Sebastian era, isn't it? Where you had Sebastian who was so dominant and the poster child of that program, and then alongside him you had Mark, who was just very, very capable, which left the Toro Rosso drivers as they were, and you had drivers cycling through them, Alguersuari and Verne and Brendan Hartley or Daniel at one point in there as well. And it was only when an opportunity opened up above him that he got that drive. If he'd been in, if he'd been 3 or 4 years older or younger as he was back then, he probably would have never got a Red Bull drive, and he probably would have been replaced. It's all about timing in Formula One. It's not just how good you are; it's being in the right place at the right time, which is, I guess, is something that Jack Doohan's currently facing. In that, he's a race winner in Formula 2, but where does he go? Because the Alpine drives are all sewn up. So it's not just a case of Liam now going out and winning the championship. He needs basically Red Bull to be ready to axe one or the other. And I wonder, also, there's a marketing value in Daniel. I wonder what the value is of that to AlphaTauri, or whatever that team's going to be known as next year. We know it's changing names. We don't know what to yet. I wonder if there's a marketing value there, that it's almost better to park him there and allow him to retire on his own terms, or retire on his own terms, in inverted commas. Give him another year. If he gets through this year, okay, give him another year. And then if it's not working at the end of next year, allow him to announce that he's not going to continue, even if it's not his decision. It's not like that ever happens in Formula One. Michael Schumacher. So, I wonder if they're looking at it from a commercial standpoint as well, because those considerations absolutely come into it, particularly at the teams that don't necessarily have their budget cap or cost cap met by prize money, where they need a little bit of help on the sponsorship front. Daniel is that help. He really is.
There's this interesting extra component to Yuki Tsunoda's story here, though, which is the Honda connection. Now, Honda is, of course, related to Red Bull Racing up until the change of regulations, at which point they'll be joining Aston Martin as the technical supplier, engine supplier. And there is this assumption that obviously Honda would love a Honda-represented driver racing a Honda-powered car. It's not necessarily going to be Yuki Tsunoda. I mean, he has to get to 2026. That's the interesting part of this story. I mean, as we stand, both Aston Martin drivers will be out of contract by then. At the moment, Fernando Alonso's contracted next year. But Lance Stroll, for me, always remains the interesting component of this, because he may not have a contract for all we know. We know that he continues to race there. He's regularly announced as their driver, but there's never any contract information. Obviously, he has a relationship with the owner, his father. That does tend to make things easier. And before we talk about this, I suppose it's worth saying, I mean, this is certainly my opinion, Matt. Feel free to voice a different opinion. But Lance Stroll's a perfectly fine racing driver. He's fast enough to have had a shot in Formula One. The bigger question, though, is if he were in any other context, would he have avoided being replaced for this long? Particularly if we look at the points breakdown at Aston Martin this year, a team that is vying for second in the Constructors' Championship. It's third and at risk of dropping down to fourth at the moment. The points comparison with his teammate Fernando Alonso is enormous. I mean, Alonso is potentially could finish second in the Drivers' Championship, which is remarkable. Lance Stroll has only around about a third of the points tally, which is one of the worst breakdowns in the sport at the moment, behind only, I think, Kevin Magnussen and Nico Hülkenberg, but we're obviously talking about way fewer points with them, so the percentages add up quicker. What will Lance Stroll ever retire from Formula One? Is it ever going to happen, and is that Yuki Tsunoda's bridge into the next Honda era, if he can make it to that point?
It's a little bit like Nicholas Latifi, really, isn't it? He came into Formula One, and let's make no mistake, anyone who gets to Formula One is an extremely good driver. Right? By comparison, we're talking single-digit percentage differences between Lewis Hamilton and Lance Stroll. These guys don't get to Formula One anymore because Dad's bought them a seat or whatever. Lance Stroll has won races every step along the way to get there. Yeah, correct. He's
dominated them.
He's quick enough to be there. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Is he good enough to drive a front-running Formula One car? The jury's currently out on that, and based on this year's performance in comparison to Fernando Alonso, who himself is a benchmark driver, you've got to say thus far, no, he's not good enough. But how much nepotism comes into the discussion there is, I guess, the crux of this conversation, isn't it? Because, I mean, he's got 47 points versus 149 for Fernando. Aston Martin is sitting third just. It's 5 points clear of Ferrari in the Constructors' Championship. but it should be arguably ahead of Mercedes. It should be in a comfortable second position if it's got two drivers firing at the same sort of level. So, imagine Aston Martin with another 100 points. That's arguably where it should be. You shouldn't have to rely on one driver doing all the work. So when you look at purely on the numbers, Lance Stroll is getting absolutely battered by Fernando Alonso. Let's qualify that again because he broke his wrist just before the season started. He hasn't been driving pain-free. His performances have improved in recent races. So there's some qualifiers there that need to be made as well. But on the whole, if you're in charge of Aston Martin, if your name is Mike Crack and you don't have Lawrence Stroll to report to, you've got any other team principal or any other team owner rather in pit lane, you've probably got the license to replace Lance. I wonder if Mike does.
Yeah. One gets the sense that perhaps not. I think it's. I mean, Lance Stroll. His wrist injuries were driving with those injuries was an immense feat of endurance. The kinds of which we only see in MotoGP, and they're cooked. Like they should not be allowed to race most of them half the time. And but Lance Stroll did an excellent job. But almost debatably, his best results came in those first few races. Like I think there is a little bit of improvement in the last month hidden by the fact that Aston Martin's also declined in competitiveness relative to the front. So I don't want to just say, well, his results have only tailed off, but I don't get the sense he's improved. Like there hasn't been as much improvement as I expected for his healed wrists, if that makes sense. Like I think he actually did really quite well, and great credit to him in those first races. But I mean, I'd really want to see some improvement from him in the second half of the year because the way he's the start of the year, he was kind of like respectively close to Fernando Alonso. Fernando, who is an all-time great of Formula One, we need to emphasize this is not just another teammate, it's Fernando Alonso. So even getting within 3/10 is pretty good, similar to any driver with Max Verstappen. But it's just felt a little bit less competitive in the last so long. But second half of the year could be a refresh he needs. There are other drivers we need to talk about, Matt, who are still out of contract. And some of these, as we get towards the back of the grid, are the ones who we may say have more likelihood of changing up just because the needs of smaller teams do differ from those of the bigger ones. Let's start at Alfa Romeo, which also has an interesting long-term game here. Won't be known as Alfa Romeo next year, for one. The Sauber team, we should probably start transitioning mentally towards that. And then before long, we'll be calling them Audi. Now, Valtteri Bottas has one more year in his contract. Zhou Guanyu doesn't. I mean, for me, Matt, Zhou's taken a pretty reasonable step forward this year. Unfortunately, the car has not, which means points have been few and far between. But to the point where in the last month or so, bar the odd race, it really feels like he's at least been on Bottas's level for many Grand Prix.
It even stretches back further than that. I remember speaking to Valtteri after the Australian Grand Prix, and he was absolutely at sea in terms of why he was the slowest car on track that weekend, and he didn't know why. And there's been a couple of events like that during the year where there's just no obvious explanation. I remember there were a couple of times where he had damaged floor. I think it was Spain that he had damage to the floor that was revealed, after the weekend once they'd gone into debrief. But Guan Yu Zhou has stepped up. The Alfa Romeo Sauber team, I've always referred to them as that because Alfa Romeo is just a commercial branding deal on top of Sauber Motorsport. So forgive me if I slip into Sauber by default. But that's an operation that Valtteri went in there and really led last year, having had his time at Mercedes. This year has been more of a struggle. We know he's got a new deal for next year, so he's safe in theory. I don't expect there to be any significant change there, purely because off-track there's so much happening behind the scenes. They're recruiting, they're in the process of transitioning ownership as well, that a significant stake of that operation has already been sold to Audi, so there is some Audi influence there, even if the name above the door hasn't changed, and that won't change for a while yet. So we will have probably 2 seasons of Sauber, you would imagine, before it switches over to Audi, and then they start telling that story. They don't want to start putting eggs in the Audi basket yet, because they don't want to start that project officially earlier than they have to, because if you start that project too early, one, it runs out of momentum in terms of the marketing value, but two, it also then besmirch the brand when they're not even in it, if that makes sense. You don't want to start putting your Audi factory drivers in there in 2025 and a car that's not absolutely on it. So I think they want stability as much as they can. If they can use known quantity drivers, I think that's probably the way they'll go. I did speak to Guan Yu Zhou's manager in one of the most recent events. I can't remember which one. It's the back-to-back events. They just merged together. It's crazy. But I had a chat with Guan Yu Zhou's manager, and there's no concern there. They're quite happy with his performance. I guess the fact that he's beating Valtteri, a driver who's won, I think off the top of my head, 12 Grand Prix. Someone in the comments will correct me if I'm wrong. And please do. I do read them. But he's put in a good account for himself. I don't see, again, anyone that's out there in the market replacing him. Even, Teo Pourchaire, who's in with a chance of winning the Formula 2 championship, he's the Sauber Academy driver. I don't see him getting a look in at this point. Another driver who's sort of in the right place at the wrong time, if that makes sense. So I think we'll see Alfa Romeo Sauber take a stable driver lineup into next year. I don't see movement there at all.
Yeah, I think that's a fair call. I think it's still waiting until Audi can really start making those decisions. Also, if you can't offer an Audi Works driver contract yet, it's going to still be hard to attract drivers. Even if you know in a couple of years it'll be Audi, it's still just not the same thing. So it does seem like that'll be a holding pattern. Now, if we look towards the end of the back of the grid, we've got Haas, Kevin Magnussen is out of contract, and also Logan Sargent at Williams. Two drivers in completely different phases of their careers with completely different expectations. Let's start with Kevin Magnussen. It's up against Nico Hulkenberg this year. Last year, demolished really. Mick Schumacher was getting closer towards the end of the year, to be fair to Mick, but it's pretty clear traffic was moving in one direction. This has been a very strong year for Nico Hulkenberg, though. A guy who hasn't driven consistently for the better part of 3 seasons comes into a car that is a little bit difficult. It is at the back, and is kind of showing Kevin Magnussen the way. Has that surprised you?
I'm going to say, yeah, it has. Because I expected it to be the other way around, in that Kevin Magnussen has had at least a year. Okay, he had the year out, but he had a year's experience last year in these new generation of cars. So I expected him to carry that forward, but he's not. So this is really, it's a tale of two halves here. Kevin has disappointed, but it just shows how good Nico Hulkenberg really is, and how much of a travesty it's probably been that he's not joined a front-running team at a point where it is a front-running team, if that makes sense. How he doesn't have a Formula 1 podium is baffling. He's 35, 36. He's been in the sport since, 2010? He got a pole position at the Brazilian Grand Prix for Williams in 2010. Now, that was weather affected, but we got a glimpse there. He still holds a lap record at I was always going to call it Eastern Creek, but it's Sydney Motorsport Park with A1GP. So, yeah.
That is obscure.
That's the way I write. It's another stat. I don't even have that one in a spreadsheet. I'll have to fix that. But, he's one of those drivers that he's an almost, if that makes sense. It's a little bit like Martin Brundle, although Martin had an opportunity in some front-running machinery, probably in the wrong years, but did get a couple of podiums. So, yeah, I'm surprised that K-Mag hasn't been more competitive. He's shown glimpses, of course, but I mean that car, we know it's hard on tyres. We know it's not responsive to developments as well. So, yeah, I don't see that team changing though, because at the moment the drivers aren't the limiting factor, and that will be the thought process, I'm sure, that's going through Gunther Steiner's head, and probably Gene Haas for that matter, especially given what happened last time they changed drivers. What is there to gain by going for, I'm just picking a name off of my list here, Stoffel Van Dorn or Antonio Giovinazzi. They're sort of the only experienced drivers out there in the market, with the exception of Mick Schumacher, and I can't see him going back there. Who do you replace Kevin Magnussen without that's able to do a better job? Pietro Fittipaldi? I'm sorry, I'd have K-Mag over Pietro.
Yeah, and I mean the team after last year, and particularly after the year before that, have been very eager to say they don't want rookies, so that eliminates anyone who hasn't got Formula One experience. And you'd almost put, your Giovinazzis and Van Dorns in a similar basket into drivers that don't have enough contemporary experience. You've got to bring them up to speed. And Giovinazzi, well, I think he had potential. It's not proven, so you're still taking a bit of a gamble. So I think you're probably right, but there'll be a lot of impetus on Kevin to really pick up the pace to at least end this year on a little bit of a high, notwithstanding that his performances tend to be better in races, and that's when this car is at its worst. So he's a little bit hamstrung with that. Finally, though, Logan Sargent, he's, in my opinion, almost a little bit under the radar, and I can't help but think that's a little bit because he's been partnered with Alex Albon, who's achieved some really strong results in a car that's usually been towards the back of the grid. He's also, just as we've seen so many times, another rookie at Williams. Inevitably, it just feels like there's I mean this with no disrespect, but there's like a disposable element to that. You kind of assume eventually they're just going to be put aside. But I've been sort of impressed a little bit with the way he's gone about it. He's shown some really great speed. I'm even thinking back all the way to Jeddah, where actually he set no qualifying time, but had he not just crossed the pit entry line, I think he would have been through to Q2. He would have out-qualified Alex Albon at one of the most ferocious circuits in Formula One straight off the bat, which would have been really impressive, and he's had better results lately. Is he under any genuine threat, do you think, at Williams, considering he's still yet to really score and match Alex Albon, or has he shown enough?
The questions haven't been as overt as perhaps they have been for Yuki Tsunoda and Kevin Magnussen that we just spoke about. But they've got to be there. Logan knows what his weaknesses are. He said in Belgium that one of the biggest problems he had is that he holds a brake pedal. I'll get my words out. Brake pedal too long. He overslows the car, and that costs him, hundredths per corner. But you add that up over a course of a lap, and you're talking tenths. So he knows what the problem is, and he knows how to fix it, which is positive. But it's something that is not easy to do. I mean, it's try tweaking your cover drive. Not easy to do, particularly when you're not allowed to go and practice. So Logan's done a good enough job, but that he's only on a 1-year commitment. The team hasn't spoken negatively about him at all. James Vowles is very complimentary, but James is also very politically astute, knows absolutely how to play the media. The way that Williams deals with the media this year is very different to what it was last year. It's far more open to a point. It gives the media the information that it wants to give the media. As a result, we're hearing its side of the story far more than perhaps we were, and as a result, there's less room for speculation. But if we wind back 12 months, during that whole Oscar Piastri contract recognition board thing, we know that Alpine had agreed a deal for Oscar to go to Williams for 2 years. So that second drive at Williams is negotiable. There are other drivers out there, I'm sure, who will be, even if it's not the most desirable seat, it's still a seat on the Formula One grid. And for the likes of Teo Porcher, Jack Doohan, Fred Vesti, these are guys who are knocking on the door if they don't get into Formula One next year. Basically, they need to leave Formula 2 at the end of the season. So Logan not only has to deliver on track, but he also has to be savvy enough off it to maintain that position, because there will be those come knocking, and he doesn't have a deal. So for mine, Logan is the most at-risk driver on the grid for next year. I still don't see the team changing, again, because the drivers aren't the limiting factor. If you put Lewis Hamilton in that car alongside Alex Albon, will they have scored more points? Maybe 1 or 2. In the context of it, what does that actually mean to the team? I mean, not a whole lot. If I just have a cheeky look at my my constructor standings, I've got 11 points at the moment. So they could potentially leap Haas. They'd be 7th or 8th in the championship still, even if they had Lewis Hamilton. Even if they had Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso, they're not going to be much further above where they are now. So the drivers aren't the limiting factor, is I guess the point that I'm making. Therefore, do you give Logan another year, see if he can work through the limitations that he's currently got? We saw in Formula 2, the kid's good. When he's on form, he was able to dominate that category. Now, Formula 2 is a little bit random, but I think he's at this point, he's probably earned another year.
I think that's fair. I think as well, to quote Mark Webber, Formula One may not be a finishing school. I'm pretty sure he said that anyway. I feel like we've been attributing that. Maybe he just was attributing it to someone at the time as well. But nonetheless, it's a worthwhile phrase, whoever said it originally. But I do also think a rookie deserves at least a second year, unless they've been completely off the pace and are clearly not cut out for it. And I don't think that's the case with Logan Sargent. I think he deserves, particularly in a car that at least half the season hasn't really been very competitive, at other races has been reasonable, deserves another crack to prove he can consolidate progress he'll have made this year. But like you say, Williams has its own desire. Every team has its own requirements for the seats that they sign up, and you never know where the next exciting twist in the driver market is going to come from. They're the drivers who are up for renewal before the end of the year. Will they get them? Will Lewis Hamilton sign before his expires this time? We don't know. We'll just have to wait and see. But you will hear about it on this podcast, I can assure you, if and when they eventually do re-sign. That is all the time we have for Pit Talk this week, though. We will be back next week for another mid-season episode to look back on the half season we've had so far and to preview what we can expect in the second half of the year. You can subscribe to Pit Talk wherever you get your podcasts. You can also watch, as we were mentioning earlier, on YouTube to see exactly which direction Matt was looking at various points in time. Just search for the Fox Sports Australia YouTube channel. Until next time, from Matt Kosh, I've been Michael Lamonato, and we'll catch you then.